Brian just gave me the title of my next book, Lincoln is an Imbecile. I joked, when the real Lincoln came out, I joked with Random House, my editor, and I said, how about that stinking Lincoln as a title? I thought it was catchy, but they didn't go for that. Okay, well, my topic, the topic that I gave Don is follow the money. Okay, why Lincoln invaded, waged total war on his own country over tax collection. And you have to understand who Lincoln was. I mean, this crowd is pretty well educated on who Lincoln was. But, I was in Springfield, Illinois several years ago. I was invited to give a talk at the Illinois Libertarian Party Convention, and of all things. So I went on a tour of Springfield and Lincoln's house and the Lincoln Presidential Museum. And he lived there's a part of town in Springfield called Old Aristocracy Row. There's a nice big sign, Old Aristocracy Row. And there are all these big houses. And Abe Lincoln lived in the biggest house on Old Aristocracy Row. So as far as to the extent that there was an aristocracy in Illinois, in those days, Lincoln was the man. And right next door to him, his next door neighbor, there's a plaque saying that this man was a manufacturer, a metallurgist or something like that. And he got the contract, this sign said, for selling tin cups to the U.S. Army during the war. Imagine that, what a coincidence. He happened to be Abe Lincoln's next door neighbor and fellow Whig politician to do that. He was the general counsel for a while for the Illinois Central Railroad. He rode around the Midwest in a private rail car with an entourage of Illinois Central executives. Erasmus Corning offered him the job of the general counsel of the New York Central Railroad. At a time when the governor of Illinois was paid $3,000 a year, Lincoln made $5,000 in one case, a tax case of all things. He won a single tax case, and he had servants in his home, and so that's who he was. He was not. I think it was Clyde Wilson once remarked at one of our events a long time ago, and this sticks in my head, that everybody lived in a log cabin on the American frontier. It wasn't just poor old Abe Lincoln who grew up in a log cabin. What do you expect? And I did tour the museum, the Lincoln Presidential Museum, and I almost got kicked out at one point because I was laughing so much. There was a sign, a big display that said, when he was 10 years old, Abe Lincoln was kicked in the head by a horse and he was thought to be dead. And I thought, I just got a big hoot out of that. Kicked in the head by a horse. So that explains a lot. And then one more story I'll tell you about this museum. There's a creepy room that very high ceiling, and it's all black curtain. The walls were covered with black cloth, and there was a spotlight going up into the top of the room, and a white ceramic Lincoln head up there. And it reminded me of the scene in The Wizard of Oz where they finally see the wizard. There's his head up in the sky and there's smoke and everything. That's what it looked like. And again, I was in there laughing, and I got my camera out, and some cop came out. You can't take any pictures, sorry. So I guess you're just supposed to walk into there and just be in awe of the head up in the sky of this thing. But they did there was a video in a theater, a very nice theater, if you can imagine. Money is spare no money, and they had an ex-slave. His picture is up there, and a voiceover saying he thought the Emancipation Proclamation was a big bunch of nonsense because I was a slave. I was there. I wasn't freed when they issued this proclamation. I still remained a slave, and I thought that was remarkable that they actually had that. So that's in a nutshell, that's who Lincoln was. Now, the one thing that I've found that enrages the Lincoln cult more than anything is to suggest that, like all other politicians in world history, he was interested in money and power. They just go nuts when you make a good argument about that, and probably one of the best quotes that I've run across in all the research and reading that I've done about this was the old quote from Edgar Lee Masters in Lincoln the Man. about how, Lincoln once said that Henry Clay was his beau ideal of a statesman, and he said all of my ideas in politics I got from Henry Clay. Trump tried to do the same thing. His first speech on economics, his writers took him to Louisville, and he claimed that he was going to be another Henry Clay. It's like Abe Lincoln. But here's what Edgar Lee Masters said. Clay was the champion of that political system which doles favors to the strong in order to win and keep their adherence to the government. His system offered shelter to devious schemes and corrupt enterprises. He was the beloved son, figuratively speaking, not literally the son, of Alexander Hamilton, with his corrupt funding schemes, excuse me, his superstitions concerning the advantage of a public debt and a people taxed to make profits for enterprises that cannot stand alone. His example and his doctrines led to the creation of a party that had no platform to announce, the Republican Party, because its principles were plunder and nothing else. That's a good idea. If you're all about plundering your neighbors, it's a good idea to keep it quiet. Don't really come out with that. But I think after writing 3 books on Lincoln and doing all the research and everything that I've done on this, I think that's the very best explanation of who Lincoln was, not just Henry Clay, but who Lincoln was. And so this, one of the long story that I tell in all 3 books, really, is and including my book on Hamilton's curse, is the evolution of this whole cabal that originated with Hamilton and in early America, that basically wanted to bring the rotten, corrupt, mercantilist economic system of the British Empire, which the Revolution was fought to escape, to America. That's always what this group of people, beginning with Hamilton, and then Henry Clay picked up that mantle, and then Lincoln, and that's sort of it really is sort of the story that I tell in all 4 books actually, my Hamilton book also, and the way I looked, I used to give public speeches talking about this, where it reminded me of a scene in the movie History of the World Part 2, where Mel Brooks played the King of France. And his laugh line was, "It's good to be the king," as though anybody would disagree with that. But like some guy, I think some guy comes in with a pallet of gold bars, and he just smiles and says, "It's good to be the king," like that. And that's what the Hamilton and the Federalists thought. That this British system is horrible. We're willing to fight an 8-year revolution to get away from that, because if you're on the paying end of an empire, you're in bad shape. But if you're in the money collecting end, it's a good gig. It's good to be the king. And they wanted to be the kings. That's why literally Hamilton wanted a permanent president. But here's what Murray Rothbard, one of my favorite old, the late Murray Rothbard, sort of a role model of mine in economics business. He wrote an article years ago that turned it into a book on the history of banking. And he said this about this cabal, this gang that preceded Lincoln. He said, and he talks about Robert Morris, who was, he's called the financier of the American Revolution. But Murray Rothbard said, no, he was more like a defense contractor who made a lot of money off of the American Revolution. Money came in his direction, not the other direction. So what Morris, Hamilton, and their associates wanted was to reimpose in the new United States a system of mercantilism and big government similar to that of Great Britain, against which the colonists had rebelled. The object was to have a strong central government, particularly a strong president or king as chief executive, built up by high taxes and heavy public debt. The strong government was to impose high tariffs to subsidize domestic manufacturers, develop a big navy to open up and subsidize foreign markets for American exports, and launch a massive system of internal public works. In short, the United States was to have a British system without Great Britain. And so that's a sort of a much more eloquent way of saying my Mel Brooks story about what this group was always about. And then he goes on to say another big part of the plan was to organize and head a central bank to provide cheap credit and expanded money for himself, Morris, and his allies with the help of his youthful disciple, Alexander Hamilton. Yeah, so he was Robert Morris's boy. in the government. He sent him, he became George Washington's Treasury Secretary. And in this, the biography of Hamilton by Ron Chernow, which is said to be the template for this dumb play on Broadway that they made about Hamilton, there's a passage about where he says when near the end of the Revolutionary War, George Washington and Hamilton have a talk, and Hamilton says that Robert Morris would like him to be Treasury Secretary in the future. I'm not sure if this was near the end of the Revolution or after. It was unclear to me in the book. And Robert and Chernow says that George Washington responded by saying, "I didn't know you knew anything about finance. We never talked about it." And and he also says that Hamilton booked up on what today we would call Cliff Notes. He approached a New England Federalist who was known for knowing about finance, and he gave him some of these sort of British mercantilist pamphlets to read, not genuine scholarship, but sort of protectionist pamphlets and things like that. And that was Hamilton's economic education. As far as it was Timothy Pickering. It was who gave him, the senator from Massachusetts. Gave him that. And so this gang sort of, they lost power. But it was Hamilton who quoted this phrase, "the American system," and then Clay picked up that mantle of the American system. Okay, and Jefferson, of course, sniffed this out pretty well. He said once that Hamilton's system was consolidation bottomed on corruption, and I think that's an almost a perfect description, just like the Edgar Lee Masters quote that I gave you. And there was once a dinner at Monticello with Jefferson, Hamilton. I think the Attorney General was there. Some real big shots. And Hamilton was apparently went on about how he thought the British government was the most perfect system, or someone said the British government is the most perfect system of government there is. And Hamilton objected, and by saying it needs a dose of corruption. If you add some corruption, it would be the perfect. But as it is now, it's not big enough. It's not powerful enough. It needs to be more powerful. And it just facts of life are it takes a little corruption to make the government more powerful than what even the British had at the time, the British Empire at the time. And you can imagine Thomas Jefferson hearing this sort of talk. And so when Hamilton did become Treasury Secretary, one of his first scams was to nationalize the war debt. And of course, the political insiders knew about this. The war debt was selling at maybe between 2 and 10% of par value. And so the insiders knew that the government was going to buy up all this debt at 100% par value. And so there was a mad rush up and down the coastline to buy up the debt from all these Revolutionary War veterans who were paid in these government bonds that are almost worthless. And they made a killing. Robert Morris made millions. Hamilton himself made a killing in doing this. And so that's what really, in my opinion, really convinced Jefferson that these people are our enemies. They're betraying the revolution. Okay, and of course, so the stories that I tell, it seems like everybody I run into here has read The Real Lincoln, so I don't want to repeat myself too much, but or wants me to sign a copy of it. But the Tariff of Abominations, every chance they got, they tried and failed until Lincoln come along. And of course, I don't need to lecture this group or tell this group much about the Tariff of Abominations. One interesting side story about the 1828 tariff that almost caused South Carolina to secede was that Henry Clay was one of the main sponsors of that. And I was telling Dawn last night that I've been delaying writing a book on Henry Clay because he's sort of the link between Hamilton and Lincoln as far as economics goes. So maybe I'll get that done soon. But the biographies that exist of Henry Clay, They barely mention that he was one of the chief sponsors of this tariff of abominations that almost caused a secession crisis in around 1830. But then, since he was on the committee that led to the compromise lower tariff, they praise him as the great compromiser. He's a great compromiser. But he started the whole thing in the first place. So you don't give him the blame for starting the mess in the first place, but you praise him, pat him on the back because he engaged in the resolution of this issue. And so that was that issue. Now, shortly after, the next chance this gang got was there was a depression in 1837, and the next chance they got to get their way was the tariff of 1842. The average tariff rate had gone down. It was, the tariff of abominations was 48% was the average tariff rate on imports, and southern farmers and Midwestern any farmers, for that matter, were double plundered by that because they manufactured little and they had to pay more for everything, just like Northerners did. But they also found that, their business partners in England, since they were impoverished because they couldn't sell their goods in America with a 48% tax, at the coastline on their products, and so they couldn't buy the rice and the tobacco and the agricultural products from American farmers as much as they could before because they were impoverished by this tariff that was aimed at them. And so they were double plundered by this. But so the first chance they got, though, to bring it back, they did in 1842, and they doubled the tariff rate from about 20% to 40%. And right away, the income of the southern farmers fell by about 20%, according to one of the books that I looked up on the history of tariffs on this. So the same thing. So the first chance they got, and the first chance they had enough power. And that led to one of the early secession meetings in South Carolina. I always thought it was Abbeville, the first one. I'm not sure of the first one, but people in Bluffton, where I now live, claim that it was the first secession meeting was in Bluffton, and it was under a large oak tree down by the May River, which is walking distance from my house. And I moved there a year and a half ago, and the meeting was organized by Robert Barnwell Rhett, who was a protege of Calhoun's, although Calhoun did not support this, and they held a meeting it was about the tariff. There's damn protectionist Yankees are plundering us again, and they held this meeting under this big oak tree. And when I first moved to Bluffton, a friend of mine said, "Oh, you got to go see the secession oak." It was called the secession oak. So I went online and looked, well, where is this? Nobody knew where it was. Well, where is it? I'd like to see the secession oak where they had this meeting. Well, where is it? And so I had to go online, and again, I went online. There was no address. There were pictures, and they said about what part of town it was. So I got on my bicycle, and I went over there. I just rode all over the place over there, and I had an article from the internet with a picture. There was a fence in the background, and I could tell, and I found it. And I took a picture, and this was January 9th, 2021. That's the picture of the secession oak where the first secession meeting in South Carolina took place. Okay, and I brought this here in a little article from South Magazine explaining the background. I want to give this to the Abbeville Institute and give it to Don. And so when I found this tree, I took the picture. That was January 9th, 2021. A couple weeks later, I read in the local paper, the Bluffton Today paper, a big storm blew through and knocked most of it down. 400-year-old, and they say it may be as old and have been as old as 400 years old. And so I ran down there, and I wanted to get a piece of it, and that's what this is right here. This chunk of wood here. I have a couple of chunks in my house of that. That's a part of the secession oak where Robert Barnwell Rhett held his first secession meeting. It was the only one I could carry away. The chainsaws had already been there, and everything, and so I got that, and I carried it off, and my car was about a mile away, so I had to. This is very heavy. I don't know what it's gonna, but And so that's my story about the secession oak. And apparently they were successful because this tax only lasted about 6 months. So they went back to the lower tax. Now that tree, they say the roots are still alive, and there's a piece of the stump sticking out of the ground right now. And so I'm thinking of changing my will to say that I want my ashes spread at the base of that tree to be used as fertilizer to help it regrow. so that's someday. So that was another big attempt of this, and they failed. But then, of course, came the moral tariff. The moral tariff, 1859. They had enough votes once again. The tariff rate was 15% or so, and they had the votes to more than double it. And as everybody here probably knows, that played a big part in precipitating the war, in more plunder. And Lincoln would sign 10 tariff increasing bills during his administration. The average tariff rate went up into the 58, 59% level, and it stayed there until the income tax came in 1913, as far as that goes. Now Lincoln, in his first inaugural address, and if you've read my books, a lot of you know about this, but think about this, that I call it Lincoln's slavery forever speech. The historians like to quote the second inaugural all the time because all these pretty words in it, with malice towards, he really meant malice towards everyone south of the Mason-Dixon, but they pretty words. But the first inaugural is his slavery forever speech. I call it the most powerful political speech in defense of American slavery ever made by an American politician, because this is the President of the United States saying, I have no intention of doing anything about slavery. I never have. You can read all my old speeches. I never changed my mind. I support a constitutional amendment, the Corwin Amendment, to make it illegal for the government to ever do anything about Southern slavery. Who has ever made a more powerful speech in defense of slavery and letting it last into the 20th century, as far as he's concerned, as long as you keep in the Union and keep paying taxes? Okay, but in the same speech, he used the words invasion and bloodshed to describe what would happen to the people in any state who believed that the Union was voluntary and they could leave and not pay his tariff tax. And the tariff tax, by the way, had been more than doubled 2 days earlier. 2 days earlier, President Buchanan signed the moral tariff into law 2 days earlier. And he was not going to do what Andrew Jackson did and go along with a compromise lower tariff. Andrew Jackson was a big wimp in Lincoln's eyes, in my opinion, for doing that, for going along with a compromise. And so also, if you look into Lincoln's background, when he got the nomination, well, it was all about the money. Let's see what page I want to look this up. And he was a lifelong protectionist. And the way he got the nomination was his handlers in Chicago, William Medal, the editor of the big Chicago newspaper, began lobbying for him to get the nomination. And they understood that Pennsylvania was a key to getting the Republican nomination. And so this seems like a funny scene, but Lincoln sent his emissary, Judge David Davis, who he would later appoint to the Supreme Court, to go to Pennsylvania with all of his past speeches on protectionism, on why we need to raise tariffs. And I had this vision when I first read about this. I had this vision of David Davis with a handcuff on this arm and a suitcase, a briefcase with Lincoln's speeches, walking around like a James Bond movie or something like that. And so they went, and Simon Cameron was a supporter, an early supporter. He would be the Secretary of War until his massive corruption forced Lincoln to get rid of him eventually. But he said this. He said, nothing about these speeches must get into the newspapers. And so they went to Thaddeus Stevens and all the steel manufacturers in Pennsylvania, and they said, look, this guy's been, he was an old Henry Clay Whig. He was a high tariff man for 30 years. He's your guy. But we don't want the public to know about this, especially the farmers, because the farmers know they always get plundered by the tariffs. And we don't want the public to know that the cost of shoes and woolen blankets and everything is going to go up when we kind of like Biden's economy today. We don't want the public to know about it, make the connection. And so that's how he got the nomination. And the big campaign slogan for Lincoln and Hannibal Hamlin was protection for home industry. It was at the bottom of their big campaign poster that they had. And so that's who Lincoln was, really. And so he had to follow through. He had to do this. He had to pay back his political supporters. He owed everything. And Lincoln was a political animal. I told somebody at breakfast this morning, his mentality reminds me of Bill Clinton, somebody who their whole life is focused on politics. Politics. It's a sickness. I think when Kerry last night talked about somebody who's like Cotton Mather, who's, okay, it's one thing to focus on God and religion. Most people think, well, there are good things that are to come out of that. You might make yourself unhappy if you're that focused on that one thing, but you're going to do good things for the world, but not in politics. You can do bad things, especially if you're an egomaniac like an Abe Lincoln was, as far as that goes. And so that's how I think of him, as that kind of person. And so he had to do this. He had to wage war. He threatened invasion and bloodshed over tax collection, literally in the first inaugural address. And that's one of the things that my critics just can't stand when I point that out. They just can't stand it, and it's right there in black and white. And they also can't stand when I point out the definition of treason in the United States Constitution. It says uses the Article 3, Section 3 has the word only. Treason is only defined as levying war upon the United States or giving aid and comfort to their enemies. Their in the plural, enemies. So you wage war on the free and independent states. That's what treason is, levying war. And how else could you define what Lincoln did? But my critics just go nuts. Dinesh D'Souza even badmouthed me on television once about that. Oh yeah, the nutty professor. But it's in the Constitution. I mean, it's right there in black and white. I think it's absolutely undeniable that's what. Lincoln, of course, redefined treason to mean criticism of him. Basically, that's how he justified arresting without due process all those people. As I said earlier, he was a railroad guy, and in 1857, he invested in land in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and then when he became president, the secession had taken place. You're in June of 1861. The Battle of First Manassas is pending, and what does he do? He calls Congress back to get the ball rolling on the Pacific Railroad bill. That's the priority, and that bill gave the president the right to decide the eastern terminus, or the starting point. I guess it wouldn't be the terminus. It's the eastern beginning of the railroad. Anybody want to take a wild guess what town Council Bluffs, Iowa. Yeah, Council Bluffs, Iowa. He talk about making a killing in real estate. And it's known today as Lincoln's Hill. If you go to Council Bluffs, Iowa, you can find Lincoln's Hill out there. And so he was an insider. Like I said, he made all this money working for the railroads, and he did this. And when he signed that, it made money for all the Hamilton never did anything like that. Hamilton's gambit, where he made all these members of Congress rich. Because they were the insiders who knew about the government purchasing of the war debt at par value. Okay, and Hamilton's purpose, Jefferson knew this perfectly, was that he wanted to buy their votes by doing that, making them rich so that they will support the Federalist Party. And then when Hamilton came around and became the champion of the Bank of the United States, a central bank, Jefferson's interpretation of that was that, well, this was a one-time deal. The making them rich with this arbitrage opportunity was a one-time thing. But these people are going to die off. They're going to retire. So we need a permanent engine of corruption. Those are Jefferson's words. And that permanent engine of corruption is a central bank. Okay, that's what Jefferson said, and he was right about that. It still right to this day. Is right about that. It brings to mind how when the crash of '08 happened, there was a historian named John Steele Gordon who wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal blaming Ron Paul. You know why he blamed Ron Paul? He said he carries forward the Jeffersonian tradition of criticizing the central bank. He said if the central bank was more powerful, this would never have happened, 2008. So he got his economics ass backwards, for one thing, and he's the guy who wrote the book Hamilton's Blessing, which gave me the idea for writing Hamilton's Curse. It's sort of a response to this same guy, John Steele Gordon. Okay, so this is not ancient history. We're still living this, the effects of all this business. So all these Republican Party big shots made a killing. Here's how D. Brown, the historian of the American West, his book, Hear That Lonesome Whistle Blow, about the transcontinental railroads. He said, when Lincoln signed this bill, he assured the fortunes of a dynasty of American families, the Brewsters, Bushnells, Olcotts, Harkers, Harrisons, Trowbridges, Landworthys, Reeds, Ogdens, Bradfords, Noises, Brooks, Cornells, and dozens of others. And so, compared to what Hamilton did, Hamilton was dealing with chump change compared to the money made by the Pacific Railroad bill. And of course, that led to the massive corruption of the Credit Mobilier scandal a few years later under Grant, as far as that goes. And so that's how Lincoln was. And as far as the bank goes, Michael Holt is the author of this History of the American Whig Party, big fat book I think it's about this fat. I have it on my shelf. It's one of these books where it's very impressive looking, but boy, to read it, it's pretty tough. But he says no one in that era was a more prolific proponent of resurrecting Hamilton's bank, the Bank of the United States, the central bank, than Lincoln was. He made stump speeches all over the place for Whig Party candidates who wanted to bring back this bank, because they always wanted this permanent engine of corruption. Okay, so these are some of the things that I've been arguing for years when I make the case that Lincoln was, like all other politicians in the history of the world, primarily interested in money and power, because the evidence is all over it. And I do take credit, by the way, for since The Real Lincoln was published, there have been quite a few pretty good books written by other critics. And most of them are not professional historians. They're just people like you who have studied up and written books. One of them is The Unpopular Mr. Lincoln. There's a book called The Unpopular Mr. Lincoln. I looked up this author and he's a musician, and I didn't know he was and he makes the case using original sources. That in his own time, he makes the case that Lincoln was by far the most hated and reviled of all American presidents. And he actually uses the word hated and reviled. And so this all, of course, changed after Lincoln's death, as far as that goes. And so that's my story for now about following the money. And these are, and I've done this in all these books. The three Lincoln books and my book on Hamilton's Curse is really following the money, which shouldn't be too unusual to you, since I'm an economist by training. A lot of people don't know that. I think I'm a historian, and that's sort of an insult to me. Sorry, Brian. Unless you got your history degree under Clyde at the University of South Carolina, I don't trust you, and you're a historian.